given by Dr. Morne from Stellenbosch University from South Africa. And there might be still a few participants and students coming in, but I think we can slowly start. And now I give the floor to Mr. Morne, please.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday morning here with me. It's a great honor for me here to be in Finland. It's my first visit. I've been here for about 3 days, and I love it. It's fantastic. Everyone's extremely friendly, and I've been welcomed and just enormously amazed by how pervasive the study of the future is in Finland. I come from South Africa, and so greetings to you from my homeland, South Africa, the home of Nelson Mandela, the land which Nobel Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu called the Rainbow Nation. It is also the place of the development of several philosophies. Among others, during our transition in 1994 from apartheid, the concept of sufficient consensus, the fact that we don't all have to agree on everything, but we need to agree sufficiently in order to make progress into the future. It's also the country where Steve Biko developed the philosophy of black consciousness, the idea that perhaps for nations to move themselves forward, and indeed race groups to do that, they must have the belief that they can do so themselves. It was also the country where Mahatma Gandhi developed his theories of peaceful protest, and that spirit of peaceful transition has indeed served South Africa well. And then we've also got the world's fastest land animal, the cheetah, so I'll be quick. Be as fast as I can be. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a tremendous honor to be with you. And I'll share some thoughts with you on where the continent might be going. It's a study that we've embarked on quite aggressively over the last few months or so. Of course, it's a crazy question to answer. The researchers in the room might argue, what an absurd question. Africa is so diverse. It has 54 countries. That's important, by the way, because up to quite recently, a very well-known international carrier would say on their announcements in their aeroplanes that they fly to China, India, Africa, and other countries. Africa is, of course, not a country. And so I'll share with you some early investigations into how Africa is perceived to some degree, and that's why the subtitle is a paradigmatic perspective. It's really about inviting you to think about what you believe to be the global paradigm of Africa, how the Western world typically would conceive of Africa, and what that has meant for its past, and of course, from my own interest as a futurist, what it might mean for the future of my great and exciting continent. Have any of you been to Africa? That's quite a few. That's quite a few, actually. And have any of you ever tried to make any money in Africa? Okay, that's a smaller group. A few adventurers and entrepreneurs. My own focus is in the work with organizational futures, and much of it is with commercial enterprises, typically with senior people, typically in large organizations. And so I will admit that I have a little bit of a commercial slant to the way that I conceive of futures thinking and its potential for the future of Africa. So let me share with you just a few ideas. Perhaps one of the most well-known ancient ideas of Africa is this expression which the Romans used at the height of the Roman Empire. Semper aliquid novi ex Africa. In other words, always something new out of Africa. Always something new out of Africa. An expression at the height of the Roman Empire. The idea that Africa presents just so many interesting things, like a little box of amazing tricks and trinkets that's available to explore. Well, it would be very interesting, of course, 2,000 years later, that to some degree that's exactly the way that Africa is now being perceived. A land of opportunity, amazing opportunity waiting to be explored. I was, of course, excited to learn that your very own Pentti Malaska made this report in a submission to the Club of Rome, Africa Beyond Famine. And that's a really important idea when it comes to how Africa is perceived, because Africa has a number of kind of typical perceptions. And so I love Malaska's idea of thinking about Africa beyond famine. What lies in the future of Africa? That extends to other cliches around Africa. Perhaps Africa beyond drought. Africa beyond HIV. South Africa has the largest number of people living with HIV anywhere in the world. Perhaps Africa beyond malaria. Or Africa beyond inequality. South Africa is the single most unequal society on the planet. Perhaps also Africa beyond dictatorships, Africa beyond civil war. What might that Africa look like? I'm fascinated by that idea, and I'm a curious student of Africa's future. This is Cape Town. It's a few kilometers from where I live. It's a shanty town. What people here in Turku throw away in your bins is what the people who live in neighborhoods like these might use to build their houses. The GDP per capita of Finland is 7.5 times that of South Africa. So the wealth discrepancy, of course, is absolutely enormous. Well, I don't live here, but it's within a few kilometers of where I live. What's interesting about this photograph is if you took it 30 years ago, it would look almost exactly the same. So this is a very interesting dilemma for the future of Africa. Africa's challenges are not news. We know about its poverty and its dilemmas. But why is it that so many of those problems appear to be intractable? If we knew we wanted to address these problems 30 years ago, how is it possible that even here at the southern tip of Africa, Africa's most flourishing economy, you still find neighborhoods that look like these? So one of the interesting challenges is to explore the idea of whether new thinking is possible for Africa. And new thinking in three sort of main ways. The one is the content of thinking about Africa. What is it that we're thinking about Africa? As Malaska said, can we think about it beyond famine? And that list of other typical characteristics that I've thought about. Then the level of thinking. What about those leaders, those dictators, and the way in which they've conceived of some of those countries as their own kind of piggy banks? And whether in fact that level of strategic thinking was present in senior people leading the continent. And then of course the method of thinking, and of course from our perspective that means not just an analytical method of thinking, but also a systemic method of thinking, a holistic method of thinking, and a futures-oriented, or as we like to say in my institute, a futures-based approach to thinking. A way of thinking that is also characterized by imagination for what Africa could be, and creativity for the way that Africa can be created in the potential that it currently already holds. So, can we imagine new thinking for Africa? Is that possible? Well, Africa has, of course, an enormous diversity. Over 54 countries, as I said, over 2,000 languages. I'm continuously amazed as I travel through Europe that people ask me to say something in African, as if only one language, of course, might exist there. We have an enormous diversity, and perhaps in that diversity lies some of the secrets for the future of Africa. One of the dilemmas of futurists is to encourage clients, beneficiaries, to think about a time yet to come. Because the mind is so enormously attracted to the past. And Africa's past is typified by these characteristics that I've mentioned. So can we enable leaders of Africa, those who want to invest in Africa, to conceive of her in a way that represents her future rather than only her past? We are, of course, as futurists, activistic rather than atavistic. In other words, we're not nihilistic, we're not fatalistic. We're firm believers in the idea that through activism, a new dispensation, a new future for Africa can be created. Rather than being atavistic, which is the idea that the habits of the forefathers will simply be perpetuated in the future. We're therefore not deterministic, of course, as futurists. We are not exclusively opportunistic, but certainly not a victim of a linear determinism that the past of Africa will in fact be the product of its future. So it's important to think about how a futurist might engage with Africa, and because we're here at a university, I thought it might be appropriate just to remind ourselves of how we sometimes think about the future. Here's a view from Jean-Marc Gaultier from Paris. This is a competition held in Paris, the turn of the century, 1900, and artists were encouraged to think about what the future of education might be. I select education for a very specific reason, because therein lies one of the greatest opportunities for the future of Africa. But just think about what's going on there. There's the professor, and there are the humble students, and there's always a worker, right? In any scenario of the future, there's always someone who has to do the work, the labourer. And there the students are, humble recipients of the knowledge that are being produced here. What's interesting about this is it's not that far away from Elon Musk's idea that a mesh will be implanted in the back and the base of your brain, and you'll never have to learn anything again, and knowledge will simply be imported, as it were. Education is also a really interesting idea in terms of its evolution. We're doing quite a bit of work on the future of education in the future of Africa, because if you left Earth 500 years ago and you came back today, here on the 1st of November in 2018, one of the only things you would recognize is the education system. There's some person standing at the front, typically white, typically male, typically middle-aged. He pretends to know. There are people sitting on chairs. He's a humble student. I doubt that that's the case here today. You look a lot more suspicious than I think some of the Romans would have looked 500 years ago, certainly. But okay, so we think of the future in really strange ways, and sometimes we accidentally get it right. At our institute, when we guide senior executives who are busy people and spend a lot of their lives in spreadsheets, one of the kind of rules of thumb we give them is this idea of 20, 30, 50. And what we mean by that is that at a senior level in an organization, you need to spend about this distribution on your intellectual time. In other words, you should spend about 20% of your time thinking about the past. And typically, what we encourage in terms of content of that thinking, if you remember that tripod diagram of mine, is that the past should typically concern itself with origins. We often refer to that as the ontological paradigm. Origins have a very interesting habit of staying around. Think about the origins of trade in Africa, the origins of Finland, the origins of the European Union. The seeds of any entity seem to have a lingering power. But then also, in terms of the past, to think about habits, customs, and traditions. Habits, customs, and traditions. Certainly for corporate foresight, but also for societal foresight, habits, customs, and traditions are things that don't just change the day after an election or the day after a launch at a big conference center. They bleed into the future. So, in addition to the consideration of the past, so even as futurists, we have a deep respect for the past. We're simply saying that that's not where we're going, of course. And then 30% on what's going on. As futurists, those of you who work in this arena will recognize this as strategic environmental scanning, which is a formalized method that is transdisciplinary in nature and encourages the student of the future to think broadly and widely in a range of disciplines and in such a way that you're not captured by your own discipline. And then we say to senior people, at least 50% of your time on the future. That is, what hasn't happened yet, what could happen, what should happen. Now, if we apply this principle to the way that many leaders in many African countries have behaved over the last few decades, we'd say that very few of them would meet this requirement. And so to a large degree, many leaders in many African countries have spent an enormous amount of time thinking about and responding to the past. Many of them have established their power base because they have been the rescuers. The rescuers from a brutal colonial regime, typically run by Western Europe. And because their power base comes from the past, they often remind their constituencies of that horrible past and how they remain the rescuer. You can see the dilemma. The dilemma is that the dialogue in fact perpetuates the past rather than creating alternative paths towards the future. So, if Africa has any skill, is it valuable? Is it useful? Do we have a nose for the future, if you like? If I can really strangle the metaphor from this photograph. It seems as if the opportunity for Africa is just so close we can sense it. But we seem to be missing it so often. And how can we change that narrative? Well, it is perhaps useful. Let's just go briefly into the past for a moment. Some of you will be familiar with the Museum in Alexandria in Egypt, a research institute with lecture halls, laboratories, where Archimedes and Euclid produced some of their work, where the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos developed the idea of solar centricity, according to many long before Galileo had his own ideas. This well-known library, in which also Aristophanes measured the Earth's circumference to an accuracy within a few hundred miles. Why do I mention this? Because Africa is often viewed as having a very limited literary tradition and as somehow not quite as sophisticated as the rest of the world in its historical intellectual development. But let's not leave it there. Some of you, if we jump forward about 600 years, will be familiar with Axum in the modern-day Eritrea and Ethiopia. And in Axum we find around 270 inscriptions of coins. And of course, if you find inscriptions on coins, this is evidence of a written tradition. Axum was, without having to read the slide, the Manhattan of its day. A multinational trading hub where people from all over the world were exchanging ideas and produce, and also where people from various religious backgrounds could come together in the apparently agnostic world of business, which is one of the reasons I'm a fascinated student of business. I think this is particularly interesting when we think now about migration from Africa and what that means for how Western Europe is now responding to the amazing diversity from Africa that is flooding in, and the perturbations that that's creating within the society in Western Europe. So Axum, this cosmopolitan, culturally diverse environment in which all these various religions used to collaborate. And by the way, there are 51 references in the Bible to Ethiopia, which I think is a really interesting idea and perhaps not very well-developed idea of the role that Africa's played in traditional religions. Let's move ahead another 100 years or so, and we find St. Augustine of Hippo in the modern-day Algeria, who developed concepts that you can see on the news, on CNN, almost every day today. The ideas of rational beings possessing free will. That translates into modern society as whether people have the right to choose. And then the idea of just war theory. What is a just war? Something that we debate on a regular basis when we look at Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and so on. That's 430 AD. Let's move on a few centuries, and I'll remind you of the kingdom of Makungubwe, the ancient kingdom of Zimbabwe, a rich city of over 5,000 citizens, in which, of course, a large number of gold trading links were established with various other places, especially on the African east coast. And still today, there's a Makungubwe collection, museum of various artifacts from this region. Some of you will recognize the name Zimbabwe because of its recent dictator, Robert Mugabe, a man who also was seen as the liberator of oppression by the colonists in the early days, when Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. But, as so many African leaders do, he overstayed his welcome, took on dictator-like qualities, and 30 years later was still in power, and his country was devastated by his decisions, many of them based on anti-colonial, self-deterministic behavior rather than future-oriented behavior. But since we're at a university, it is perhaps also important to point out that many believe that this was the world's first university. This is Ez-Zitouna in Tunisia. I was there a few months ago. And this was established in 737, subsequently modernized in the mid-20th century. The world's first university. Now, I know Bologna likes to lay claim to this idea of 1088. But I'm not alone in my view here. This is the UNESCO view, that the world's university started here. Perhaps you thought, well, that's an exception. That's 737. Let's move on just 110 years or so, and we have the world's oldest continuous university at Al Qarawin in Fez in Morocco. If you thought that was an exception also, then in Cairo in 970 AD, we had the formation of Al-Azhar University. These are three enormously globally impactful universities established long before the learned folks of Bologna had even their idea. In the mid-12th century, some of you will have heard of the University of Timbuktu, where even today in Mali a large number of scrolls, hundreds of scrolls are available, all sorts of learned texts on astronomy, on mathematics, and on philosophy. It would be a few hundred years until Africa had its next university at Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone. But as it turns out, this would be an ominous introduction to something that would change the future of Africa forever, known as the Berlin Conference. At the Berlin Conference in 1954, powers from Western Europe got together in an attempt to sort out what was known as the scramble for Africa. It was clear that Africa would offer much promise. And so leaders and diplomats from various Western European countries came together and literally chopped up Africa as if it was their own little pizza. You take this part, I'll take this part, maybe we'll chop it off at this river, you take the north, I take the south, and so on. Of course, this was done with almost no understanding of the tribal traditions of Africa, of how nations would relate to each other. with no understanding for the migratory paths of animals and birds. A simple, brutal chopping up for personal benefit. And this would lay the foundation for a disastrous century for Africa to come, as it tries to struggle from this really arbitrary segmentation of its society and its wildlife. And so a century later, in a desperate attempt to reunite Africa following the segmentation that occurred in the Berlin Conference, we see the formation of the Organization for African Unity. A new dawn in the future of Africa. The idea that Africa can once again, following this segmentation, create some kind of unity. And African countries begin to be liberated from the rule of their erstwhile colonial masters. But of course, the story doesn't end just as beautifully as it started. Because what happens is that those really without any experience of power now come to power. And as we can see in the West and anywhere else, power corrupts. In Africa, we like to say power corrupts even though we need electricity. So the OAU was established in the early 1960s, and of course an attempt is made to reunite Africa. Let's move into the popular mind a little bit with the Academy Awards. Some of you are familiar with Out of Africa. A really deeply colonial tale of a woman who comes to Africa she's of course from Western Europe, tries to find her fortunes and battles the elements. She has a philandering husband, of course, but nevertheless finds her way here in Africa with the help, of course, of locals deemed to be largely uneducated helpers as she, forges her own new path. If we can just stay with the movie industry for a little bit, some of you may have seen Tsotsi, one of the other few Academy Award-winning movies from Africa, coming specifically from South Africa. It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. But what I found disturbing about this is that, of course, it would require a Tsotsi, which is local language for gangster, to create an Academy Award-winning piece. And so what we have essentially in the mind of so many people in the world is a European finding her way with the help of local Africans, and a gangster making his way in a desperate world of crime and desperation. Well, of course, as we could see, what happened to Africa's intellectual tradition that I've now explained over a few centuries? Let's fast forward a little bit to that Bible of the modern capitalist mind, The Economist. This is the front cover from May 2000, the turn of the century. Someone thought maybe it's worth having a look at Africa. And the front cover reads, "The hopeless continent." The hopeless continent. Give up now. You might as well leave. And I did. I went to Europe, like many of my friends, to pursue interesting opportunities. So there we have a young boy, teenage soldier, armed not with a book but with an Uzi. And the Economist says, well, just give up now. It's not going to get any better. This is what happens if you spend too much time on an aeroplane. You start playing with PowerPoint a little bit. Some people from Africa have found that a little bit offensive. But let's move on a decade. Now the Economist is starting to change its tune. It moves from the hopeless continent to Africa rising. This is an interesting, very dramatic shift in the dialogue of Africa. What happened? What happened? Well, of course, the knowledge of Africa started to spread. Africa was not just a war of the Askari and the military junta, the dictators, the HIV, the malaria, the poverty, the heat, and the lions. Suddenly, the data of Africa started to spread around the world. Think about the idea that The internet by this time has gained large appeal all around the world, and the smartphone has started to gain mass global penetration just 2 years before. That's December 2011. Astonishingly, in a rare example of a desperate lack of creativity, Time magazine, less than a year later, uses exactly the same title as The Economist. They also feel that Africa is rising. Well, if The Economist says so and Time magazine says so, well, it must be true. That's December 11 and November 2012. Only a few months later, The Economist is back in Africa. You can see there's an increased frequency now. Now Africa is aspiring. Yeah. Consider the path now, colleagues. We've come from it being hopeless to it rising to aspiring. Now we're starting to see the opportunity for citizens in Africa to have a better life. As we like to say in Africa, better life for all. And this African animal...
gene manipulated?
What's that?
Gene manipulated.
Yes, that's right. Yes, manipulated gene. It doesn't really look exactly like that, but it is interesting. It's a bit of a caricature of an African animal. And, I mean, maybe we should just leave it there, but Africa is caricatured, right? Think about the Lion King and Mufasa and so on. Well, here you have the giraffe, but the giraffe has become an image for futurists in Africa. It's called Mlulamiti. And why would you imagine that the giraffe would become an icon for people who study the future? Well, of course, because it's the periscope. Yeah? It looks above the noise and above the mess, and it can somehow see what's coming. That's March 2013. And then in April 2016, pragmatism starts to kick in. We're making Africa work. Okay, so there are opportunities. How do we make it work? How do we make it work? Which is a much better question to ask than how do I avoid a 15-year-old shooting me through the head with an Uzi? And then more recently, in August 2016, Africa's fragile democracies. Africa's fragile democracies. It's a lovely thing to find something about Africa that you can criticize. Now, which problem would you rather have? Escape a 15-year-old's Uzi, or debate the quality of your democracy? So, I do find it interesting that we're debating the quality of Africa's democracy when in fact the rise of democracy in Africa is the real story, not how fragile it might be. Seems to me that there are some other countries around the world whose democracies might be equally fragile. Okay, and then The Economist published this picture, which shook a lot of people. It showed the true size of the African continent, not their colonial masters, as you might think, but its true size. And as you can see there, there's China, Japan fits in there, the United States, Spain, France, Germany, Italy. I don't know if we can squeeze Finland in there as well somewhere. There's India, the UK, and so on. And to many people, this was an amazing realization. Could this really be the true size of this continent? And it turns out that the standard map that we view doesn't begin to explain the real size of Africa in relation to the other parts of the world. And it would be in an American television show, The West Wing, where there would be a discussion and a debate about whether a more democratic map for the world is now necessary, now that we're beginning to understand the actual relative size of these various continents. So you can see it's a fairly big place, fairly large number of people. And as it turns out, Africa has over 1.2 billion people. And that population, just in very broad demographic terms, is likely to at least double by 2050. We'll have about 2.5 billion people on the continent. The expectation is also that by that year, the total urban population of Africa will be its current total population. So in other words, urbanization is one of the massive macro trends across the African continent in the next few decades. UNESCO argues that by around the mid-2040s, 4 out of every 10 young people in the world will be an African. Now, I think if you're a global business, you ignore this idea at your peril. If you're trying to expand, you're trying to find new markets in an economy that's already flattening out, the obvious question for a strategist is, where is the growth coming from? Let's be a little bit more recent and extend that paradigm on how Africa is often viewed. Here's a headline from CNN. It says, Trump praises healthcare of Namibia. Some of you may know there is no country called Namibia. It doesn't exist. It's called Namibia, as some of you may know. But perhaps the orange messiah, nothing surprises us anymore. Then in response to the reference to Namibia, someone who lives in Namibia, produces this map in which they create a number of sort of fictitious names for the rest of Africa. And this creates, as it turns out, a lot of sensitivity in various parts of the world, especially in North Africa. Trump doesn't stop there, of course. Never let ignorance stop you. He proceeds to refer to countries from Africa in extremely unflattering tones, and then denies he said it, and then of course his aides said he did say it, and so on. David Cameron then has a discussion with the Queen, as one does, and shares his view that several countries in Africa are what he calls fantastically corrupt. Fantastically corrupt. And then the president at the time of Nigeria, Buhari, had an amazing response. One of the great responses I've ever seen from an African leader. He said, "That's okay, we'll forgive you. Just pay back the money you stole. Just bring back the natural resources and we can be friends." How about that? Yeah? The British Museum didn't get its content from Kent. And then the Business Day quoted me because I responded to Cameron and I said, Africa doesn't just have one tale to tell. Africa is a diverse place. Yes, there is some corruption, but Africa is not unique in that respect. And there are many other dimensions to Africa, and we need to think a little bit more broadly. And then very recently, Melania, companion of the Trumpster, comes to Africa and wears a pith hat. Now, if you're not familiar with Africa, some of you may be interested to know that this is like waving a flag while screaming, "I'm a colonialist." That's really what it means. The symbolism is absolutely staggering. Now, what we have to consider is whether her ignorance is equally staggering, or whether, in fact, she knew exactly what she was doing. Did she know that she would send a message like this? That the people of Africa would somehow read the signal, that what she's saying is, I can wear white in the land of dust with my colonial helmet and show you that I'm not part of you. I'm somehow removed. I'm somehow superior. But of course, this is not limited to the uneducated models of presidents. I recently had this debate with some Stanford colleagues, and I found this publication in the Stanford Library that referenced ethnicity and socio-political change in Africa and other countries. Talking about educated people, multiple degrees, the Western world, and of course Africa is still seen as a country. Many of you will know that one of the things that's happening in Africa is that it's developing a sense of regional economy. And so those 5 regions are starting to develop mechanisms in which they can trade with each other. It turns out this is a really important mechanism for the future of Africa. Did you know that only 16% of Africa's total GDP is intra-Africa trade? of the total African trade, only 16% of that is African countries trading with each other. That's an absolutely absurd idea. There are a few very good reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the old trade routes with their erstwhile colonial masters is still very well established. And some of those colonial masters still have preferential rights over basic elements and mining licenses and so on. That's one reason. The other reason is that it turns out that as much as there's dialogue around an African brotherhood and sisterhood, many people in Africa still think of the West somehow as a preferred trading partner. But this presents an absolutely enormous opportunity for the future of Africa. So, as futurists like to do, just think about where these trends start to converge. A rise in democracy, a continental integration, a rise in literacy rates, rapid demographic explosion, dramatic urbanization, extensive internet penetration. And suddenly, if you had to develop the scenarios for Africa, you'd have to say, as complex as they might be in the short term, in the longer term, they present an enormous business opportunity. I do not work for the African Trade Commission or something like that, by the way. This is simply a view on what Africa might be offering us. And so Africa continues down this path, very recently, as you can see, in March of this year, by establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, in which it wants to produce one African market. Already in certain areas in Africa, a regional passport is being issued, such as in East Africa. Just imagine what it might mean for the freedom of movement. You might be interested to know, if you're even in gender studies, this is an important issue, because it turns out that women's rights are developed by free trade agreements in Africa. You might say, wow, that's a really big stretch. But if you look at the systemic systems modeling, you find that women often trade with their freedom, their bodies, and so on, just to move to markets to get food to feed their families, especially if some of those markets are across borders. The research are quite staggering. The findings are quite staggering. So, this, I think, presents an enormous opportunity for the future of South Africa. Nigeria and South Africa remain a little bit suspicious on whether this will be beneficial. But I think they will lose an opportunity if, in fact, they pursue that suspicion. It's interesting also to note that in July, just a few months ago, India's Modi plans 18 new African embassies. You know, of course, that Africa, India, and China together form about half the world's population, or close to it. And now India, about 1.3 billion people, establishes 18 new embassies. This is what futurists might call a very strong signal. And it may go beyond being a signal and be a trigger for what's to come in the future of Africa-India relations. The demographics I've explained, and I can show you the numbers, but you can see that that's the African Christmas tree, that's the European Christmas tree. And they are vastly different. Africa's young people are on the rise. Here's an oversimplified version of an important study for us in Africa, the so-called African demographic dividend. For those of you not working in this area frequently, the demographic dividend is the idea that those of working age in their total number exceeds those of non-working age. In other words, those between the numbers we use are typically those 16 to 64 of working age as a ratio to those under 16 and over 64. Let's just look at the prognosis. It's a little bit blurry, apologies, but if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that's the red line, you can see that demographic dividend started to change around the turn of the century. Now, that's 1990. Can you remember that the Economist started to change their tune around the same time? And look at what happens there. the projection is that that demographic dividend continues to grow until the mid-2060s. That's a staggeringly long-term trend. In other words, colleagues, in plain language, the number of people of working age as a percentage of those of non-working age continues to increase for the next 40 years. So, I think your university is absolutely right to think of educational export to Africa as a very strong opportunity for your future funding. Just if we look at East Africa, it was much more pronounced, but will drop off a little bit more. In South Africa, blue is East Africa. In South Africa, that's the green line. We still have the potential for that dividend until about the late 2030s. But it's very important to understand that the dividend could also be, if you talk about investment terminology, it might be a rights issue. In other words, it might be that that dividend does not pay any dividend. In fact, it requires more investment. So how do we access that dividend? It will not be accessed, of course, unless we have the education that we need, unless we sort out security, unless we develop more democratic or democratic type institutions, strong organizational and constitutional institutions, and a moral code, together with, of course, sorting out some of the really fundamental health issues. Unless leaders in Africa can make sure that those criteria are met, the dividend, in fact, will not pay off. This is very important for futurists because this kind of trend it's like the Halley's Comet of futures, that it really only comes around every now and then. And if you miss it in the next few decades, if African leaders miss the opportunity for an African dividend in the next few decades, well, then the really long-term prognosis is truly disastrous. In other words, there's a window of opportunity for Africa in the next 3 decades, which, unless it is accessed, will, in my view, spiral Africa into an utter disaster, in which urbanization will be chaotic. The youth will be completely beyond control. And political stability will once again, I think, spiral into a downward disaster. Now, I don't think that will happen. Because I think there are many things working in the favor of Africa that will ensure that dictators will lose their grip on the society. In fact, here's a warning. If you're an African dictator, your days are numbered. Let's assume none of you are an African dictator, shall we, for just a moment. Your days are numbered, and I'll tell you why. The youth are coming for you, and you're not going to see it coming. You will think that you can still control the society with your ridiculous utterances and your warped philosophies of the world, when in fact the youth will have vastly studied many things you couldn't have imagined in your own history. Of course, Africa has to be competitive. We have a relationship with INSEAD, which is the world's best business school, apart from Turku and Stellenbosch, of course. And in that, INSEAD publishes the Global Talent Competitiveness Index. And in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, you can see the current statistics are not that good. But you can see we compare well with the OECD on some of those elements, like labour market efficiency. We're starting to improve, and goods market efficiency and so on. Primary care still has a long way to go. Business sophistication in certain areas is very well developed, but it's a very mixed bag. So at least the data is starting to be gathered so that people who want to make long-term decisions for Africa have access to this data. Here's a great story for why those dictators will fall. The youth have given up on government. That doesn't mean everybody, of course, but this is a sign that that's happening. So all over Africa, at that last data we have for sub-Saharan Africa there, even though there's some North Africa data available, There was 314 active tech hubs in 93 cities in 42 countries. In other words, these are young people organizing themselves, very much as your student union is starting to do. And these are young people who say we now have to look after ourselves. We have access to the information. We can educate ourselves. Dictators cannot control curricula because we have access to the internet. Information cannot be locked down. And for that reason, I think there's an enormous opportunity in the rest of Africa. We developed a number of scenarios, and a lot of those scenarios for Africa were in fact paradigmatically driven. This is a very interesting characteristic for Africa because the paradigms are just so entrenched. I won't bore you with all that detail, but I will tell you that scenarios for many developing economies like South Africa are very heavily influenced by paradigms. And we find it really interesting that in much of Western Europe now, with the immigration challenge, paradigmatic issues again are on the forefront. And one of those is the idea of cohesion and collaboration in the society versus factionalism and self-interest. Do we think about our own interest, or do we think about our societal interest? And then this, I would say, is one of the key findings that we always communicate when we think about the interests of the future of Africa. And in this set of scenarios which we developed for the International Labour Organization and presented in Geneva last year, we described it as the continuum of a paradigmatic exceptionalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, surfing the fourth industrial revolution. Let me just briefly explain. By exceptionalism, I mean the idea that we are different. We're special. We're a special little case, and we deserve special little rules. In the short term, this does wonders for social cohesion, because it makes you feel part of a little community. But in the longer term, it's extremely dangerous for things like international trade. As we often say to some of the politicians and political executives that we work with, the key to FDI, the key to foreign direct investment, is in the F. It's in the foreign. Unless you're able to engage with the outside world, you'll find yourself excluded and in fact locked down from that trade. So, African exceptionalism has been one of the curses of the history of Africa, the idea that we're different and we're special and nobody understands us. Because what that has meant is that when Moody's downgrade you, you say, well, they have a Western agenda. And when Standard & Poor's downgrade you, you say, well, they don't understand Africa. And when the International Criminal Court accuses you, you go, oh, but why don't you attack Tony Blair? And that kind of exceptionalism, I think, is extremely dangerous for the future of Africa. Because in the longer term, it starts to defend deeply dysfunctional behavior that, of course, reduces the possibility of growth. On the other hand, what we call surfing the fourth industrial revolution, this is the internationalization agenda. This is behavior from senior people that seek out active signatorships to international conventions on human rights, on governance, whether in corporate governance or on the public sector. International standards of productivity, international standards of literacy, international standards of transparency and access to information. When we did this work for South Africa about a year ago, the view was that we were dramatically exceptionalistic and becoming more so, and we were classically factionalistic and becoming more so. And the prognosis was really weak, but Africa is interesting. On a hair's breadth, we had a change of leadership from a man who's deeply culturally exceptionalistic to a man that's international in his outlook. And suddenly the prognosis is different. When we talk to chambers of commerce now, their view is that we're moving actively towards internationalization, and we're moving actively towards a sense of social cohesion. And the view is that these two drivers will have a massive impact on the future, not only of our own country, but indeed the rest of Africa. we added also a very important additional dimension, paradigmatic dimension, of growth on the one hand and redistribution on the other. In Western Europe, my experience is that this is not a very well developed idea because simply it's not necessary. Certainly not in the whole society because the society is relatively equal. But in many places in Africa, including in South Africa, as I mentioned, the world's most unequal society, this is a very important debate. Those in the redistribution camp have the view that what should happen is that those should share what they have with those who don't have. By the way, if you're in that camp, we're very happy to take your money. What we also find, in other words, is many people in Western Europe are of that view, but they themselves are really quite unwilling to redistribute anything. On the other side, we have those with a view of growth. Yes, typically market-oriented. We know the free market has its limits. That's not the debate I want to introduce. But the idea that it's not about redistribution, it's about creating more for more. And of course you can combine the two, and we're starting to hear early noises, early dialogue on the idea of redistributive growth. The idea that perhaps brutal exploitative growth is a dying model, and that perhaps more redistributive, equitable, job-rich growth might be a way out. And we added to this the dimension of education, but not just whether people are educated or not, because in the South African economy, for example, education spend is one of the largest as a percentage of GDP of any other country in the world. In other words, we spend a huge amount of money in education. The problem is the return is not there. And once again, let me acknowledge that ROI is perhaps terminology more closely associated with the market. So, let me just share with you the two extreme scenarios. In this scenario here, we continue to be exceptionalistic, redistribution-oriented, low ROI from investment, and factionalistic, and we call that the Hunger Games scenario. But we do think it's possible that in South Africa, especially now, we're moving towards social collaboration, greater international conventions, an increase in the return on investment from education, particularly because of a more balanced relationship with labor unions, and also a finer balance between growth and redistribution. And that's the clean version, the version that the media made available. You're welcome to have a look at it. So, for the future of Africa, any organization, any company, my company, has to really position itself within its national development plan, of course the Sustainable Development Goals, but then also Agenda 2063, the single most ambitious plan ever created for the future of Africa. Multi-decadal, hugely futures-oriented, and enormously ambitious. So as futurists, some of you will know that we say that those who know where they come from also know where they've been. In your context, this might not be sensitive at all. In the African context, when I put up this slide, there's a rumble in the room without exception. We've never done it once where there hasn't been a fairly dramatic response. Why? Because the past weighs so much. The past takes an enormous proportion of the time of our intellectual processing. So, colleagues, I'm making a case, I know, for the future of Africa. I think the paradigms in terms of content, what we've thought about Africa, method, how we've thought about Africa, level, the extent to which we've imagined higher order possibilities for Africa have been lacking, but the ground is shifting beneath our feet. And you're welcome in Africa's future. Perhaps I'll pause there and we can have a little bit of a discussion.